Maeglin and Melanin, and well met indeed. I am Eärendel Galadirathon, the head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer for Medieval 2 Total War. But welcome again to another lore video, and the second of two parts on the story of Gondolin. There won't be too much ado before we get in, but a few points to note. First and foremost, almost everything that you're about to hear comes from the complete history of Middle-earth. Well, that's not entirely correct. Tolkien wrote a story, a lay, if you will, called The Fall of Gondolin. He wrote it very early on in the Legendarium's history, creation. But it was never published on its own. It's only published through, as I say, The Complete History of Middle-earth by Christopher Tolkien, which is a gathering of all of his father's works. And they're massive, huge tomes of books they are. But it's important to note that this story was written very, very early on, and quite a few bits and pieces of this information was changed by Tolkien later on. Now, I'll talk more about this at the end, when you've actually heard the story, and then it makes a bit more sense. But the one thing that you should note going through are the Balrogs. The Balrogs, in the original writing of this story, and the one that you're about to hear, they were numerous. They were incredibly numerous. Rather than being giant, great beasts and creatures that would wipe out whole armies on their own, they were kind of more like elite shock troops. They were still very powerful, don't get me wrong, but as you'll see from the story, a couple of elves are able to take down 5 of them on their own. Turgon goes through a heap of them. But they were then since changed by Tolkien quite later on, and they were edited to that there were only 7 of them in total. So parts of this story remain canonical, and a large part of it has since been edited and warped and adjusted, but Tolkien never went back and amended the story to reflect that. So as we go through the story, there'll be numerous accounts where many Balrogs die, but then you'll be thinking, but hang on, the Balrogs, you're thinking of the Balrogs from the Fellowship of the Ring. And if they're killing that many, then these people are practically gods. But do just temper that thought, for the Balrogs were lesser in stature when this story was written. But as I say, if you want to keep up with the story, if you want to learn more about it yourself, it's all in The Complete History of Middle-earth. Book number... can't remember. There are 3 of them. Well, no, there's 13 of them, but I have them in 3 tomes, if you will. And I think it was the first one. I can't remember. But let's get to it then. So we're dealing obviously with Gondolin again, which is roughly in the centre of your map there, just to the west of Tuor Nu Fuin, what was Dorthonion. And we'd lead on from where we left off at the last episode. And in the last episode, the last major plot point really was that Tuor. I said Turgon at the beginning as well, didn't I? Tuor, the man, has wed Eärendel, the daughter of Turgon and the king of Gondolin. Well, Turgon is the king, Eärendel obviously isn't. So we pick up our story then in the 503rd year since Feanor landed in Beleriand, and the birth of Eärendel. So Eärendel comes to the world 503 years into the Noldor's return to Beleriand. And he's born obviously to Eärendel and Tuor. Now, Eärendel is a rather far-sighted lady, and fearing that there's a great doom coming towards Gondolin, she instructs the construction of a secret tunnel that is dug out from underneath her and Tuor's house, and it leads out into the plain of Gondolin, of the plain of Tumladen, and it leads out to the mountains. And this she keeps completely secret. She is still very afeard of Maeglin, her cousin, and she doesn't want him getting sight of it. There are hardly anyone in Gondolin who know of this passage, save the people that work on it, Tuor and Eärendel. But it is with Maeglin that our story first takes its real turn and the points come to the fore. Now, Maeglin was the head of all of the elves that worked on the mining and stonemasonry in Gondolin. So he would often venture outside into the encircling mountains, where he would lead mining parties and they would bring back stone and ore for the city. On one of these ventures out into the mountains, Maeglin is captured by scouting orcs, and he is led back to Melkor. Now, Maeglin is not a coward or a weakling by any means. I mean, he's a dark person, and there's more than darkness really within him, but he's not a coward, and neither is he a weakling. But he is tortured unendingly by Morgoth, until he eventually reveals the whereabouts of Gondolin. Now, Morgoth plays partly on the torture, but he also plays to Maeglin's desires. For Morgoth promises him not only lordship of the city, if he shows him where it is, but he also says that Maeglin will have the hand of Idril. Morgoth will ensure that Idril can become his bride. So, Maeglin's treachery is in part due to the darkness of his heart and his desire for his own cousin and his basically, his just desire for her, bringing the city down. But equally, he is tortured ceaselessly. And eventually he does break. But Morgoth, fearing that if the elves learn that Maeglin is missing, they might come looking for him, Morgoth sends him back to the city. And this is where I would suggest, the real treachery happens, because Morgoth sends Maeglin back. And whilst Maeglin was tortured to give up that information, he's now back in the city and he could tell Turgon exactly what is about to happen, and he doesn't. And that, I think, is the point at which he shows his treachery. His desire for his cousin has grown too strong, and he now sells out the city. So, a little while later, at the coming of the summer, in the 7th year of Eärendel's life, so 510th year since Feanor landed, the elves are gathered on the walls of Gondolin, up atop the high walls, which is their custom, and as the sun breaks over the mountains and welcomes the first day of summer, they sing out to the glory of the sun. But on this particular occasion, as the sun climbs atop the encircling mountains, they are greeted by not just the glory of the sun, but the shadow of Morgoth's army as it climbs over the mountains and down into the plain of Tumladen. Morgoth had finally found the city, and he had come. But, I say but an awful lot, I apologise. Before we get into the actual Withertwoos and the Y4s of the actual battle, there is some background information that we should go through. And this is, of course, the 12 Houses of Gondolin. A fascinating feature, I think, and one of the few times that Tolkien really delves into a more day-to-day information, and indeed a more military side of his legendarium. So, the Gondolin Rim, which is the name of all the people of Gondolin, they're grouped into these houses, and each house oversees or plays a different part in the military and the running of the city. And at the top, and the highest and greatest of the houses, of course, is the House of the King, and this is led by Turgon. Their colouring is white, gold and red, and their symbol is that of the moon, the sun and a scarlet heart, as quite nicely depicted by whoever drew this image. Oh, I didn't do my disclaimer. None of the images are created by me. If anyone has a problem with any of the images, do just let me know and we'll work it out. So the next house is the House of the Wing, or sometimes the White Wing, and this is led by Tuor. Now that's in the bottom row, third in from the left-hand side. Wings adorn all of their heraldry, so they have wings on their helmets, and indeed they have a wing on their shields and on their banners and flags. And that house was actually created purposefully for Tuor. They are kind of his bodyguard, his family's bodyguard. So not just for him, but also for him and Idril. And then we come to the House of the Mole, which is in the middle line on the furthest on the right-hand side. Now, they don't actually have any emblem. Their symbol is just a plain black whatever. If it's a banner, it's plain black. If it's a shield, it's plain black. Maeglin is, of course, their leader, and they are the chief masons and miners and oarsmen. That's not a word, that's a person who rows a boat. They're the chief craftsmen, if you will, but specifically related to masonry. And they go out and they do all the mining. They are noted in battle for having two-headed axes, so they're two-handed axes with a head on each end. Next we come to the House of the Swallow. Now this is led by an elf called Dwelin, and these are some of the finest archers of Gondolin. They're in the middle again, furthest on the left with the arrowhead. They dress in white and blue and purple and black, and they often have feathers on their helmets and feathers on their heraldry. And as I say, they are one of the two houses which are the greatest archers of Gondolin, and that is their chief purpose. They are arrayed on the walls when the battle begins, for they begin raining hell down upon the enemy. So next we then come to the House of the Heavenly Arch, which is on the top row on the furthest on the left with the odd rainbow symbol in the middle. Now these are also fine archers. So the Swallow and the Heavenly Arch are the two greatest archer houses. But these people are kind of the nobles and the wealthy of Gondolin. That doesn't stop them fighting, though, which is quite an interesting side point. But the Heavenly Arch are the most fabulously wealthy of all the houses, and they are outfitted as such. Their shields have gems and all kinds of things on them. The symbol that they have there is supposed to denote the 7 gems that they have as their heraldry. So they always have 7 gems as their items, and these are rubies, amethysts, sapphires, emeralds, chrysoprates. I've never even heard of that word. Topazes and amber. I had to write those down because I never remember those. They often had an opal in their helmets as well. So these are just the very, very wealthy of Gondolin, and they form an archer battalion as well. And as I say, I didn't say, but their leader is Egalmoth. Now, some of these names will actually feature throughout the story. Some of them never really come into it, save that, spoiler alert, perhaps they're mentioned only because they died. But some of them actually play big parts in the coming battle. So do remember some of the names. So Egalmoth leads the Heavenly Arch. And then we come to the House of the Pillar and the House of the Tower of Snow, which are the bottom 2 in the bottom left. These are both led by an elf called Penlod, and he is said to be the tallest of all the elves of Gondolin, which is a rather poor moniker, to be honest, given what some of his brothers are about to have. So the Tower of Snow and Pillar, very little known about them, and save that Penlod is the tallest of the elves, which is probably why the pillar and a tower are their symbols. They might be all tall elves. That may be the requirement to join. And then we come to the House of the Tree, which is in the top row on the furthest on the right. And this is led by an elf called Galdor. And he is said to be the greatest in valour after Turgon. So he's one of their finest warriors. And he leads the House of the Tree. Now they, interestingly, go to battle with iron-studded clubs. And they use slings. And of course, green is the colour of their battlery. And then we come to one of the houses which almost everybody knows, and that is the House of the Golden Flower, and that is because it is led by Glorfindel. And of course, they have gloriously golden armour, and a bright sun or a bright golden flower is always the symbol of their heraldry. And they are just some of the finest warriors. And of course, Glorfindel is the Glorfindel, well, depending on how you see it, depending on which... I believe Tolkien did set it in stone before he did pass. But Glorfindel mentioned here is the same Glorfindel who saves Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring. And then we come to another house, the House of the Fountain. The House of the Fountain is led by mighty Ecthelion, perhaps the greatest elf in all of existence. Ecthelion is a fine warrior and an absolutely staunch and loved leader. The Fountain have silver and diamonds as their decorative symbols. And they often have long, pale swords. So they're sword and shieldmen, basically. But they're most noted for marching into battle at the playing of flutes. So whenever the House of the Fountain fights, the sound of flutes play. And all of them are actually fine flautists. So they're kind of a musical house, but they're also absolutely formidable warriors. It's not to say musicians can't be formidable warriors, but it's an odd pairing, I'd suggest. The House of the Harp is also another, and it is in the centre of the third line there, the penultimate house. And now their leader is a gentleman called Salgant, and he's interesting because he's basically a coward, as you'll see as we go through. And he absolutely fawns after Maeglin. He's kind of the closest thing Maeglin has to an evil accomplice. He is the worm tongue to Maeglin's Saruman, but he's useless. But he leads the House of the Harp. Now their symbol is always silver. They have silver colouring and silver heraldry, but there's obviously a harp in it. And often there's a black background as well. It's worthwhile noting at this point as well that the Gondolin Rim are very well known for not riding into battle. They are entirely a foot archer and foot melee force nation. They don't ride cavalry. But Salgant is the only elf listed to have ridden a horse in the battles for Gondolin. Which I think says something a little bit more about his cowardice. He basically rides a horse so he can escape quicker. Everyone else fights on foot, showing their stalwart defender-like nature. And finally, one of the greatest houses and one of the greatest losses in the fall of Gondolin is the House of the Hammer of Wrath. Now these are led by an elf called Rog. And he is the physically strongest of all the elves. in Gondolin. So Turgon is one of their finest warriors, if not the finest warrior. Galdor and Ecthelion and Glorfindel are then close seconds, along with Tuor, who is obviously a man. But the actual physically most powerful is Rog. So whereas Turgon, Galdor, Ecthelion and Glorfindel might, I don't know, face overwhelming odds and not back down and be totally stalwart, Rog might question fighting those kind of battles. But if he went in, he goes in hard. And he leads the House of the Hammer of Wrath. And these are all of the smiths and artisans of Gondolin. They went into battle with huge maces, mighty heavy shields, and their symbol was always a stricken anvil, as you see on the screen there, with a hammer, and there's always sparks coming from it, or Tolkien describes it as spitteth sparks. Their colours are red, gold, and black, or iron black it's described as. And they are actually the most numerous and greatest of all the houses. I think because they kind of make up the worker tier, if you will. Like, almost every civilization in history has some form of caste system. With the basics being you've got nobles / warriors, priests and workers. And the House of the Hammer of Wrath makes up that kind of working class. They're the smiths, the artisans and whatnot. Along with the House of the Mole, they are very, very numerous. And they feature prominently in the story. So, we come to it at last then, the actual fall of Gondolin. So the elves have seen this army coming over the mountains. They're preparing in their city for what is to be a real fight. Now, I don't have any images of this, but another bit of background information that I've actually not really listed because it's a huge break from what Tolkien then created as his lore. And let's devote a little bit of time talking about the armies of Morgoth. The armies of Morgoth in this battle are led by creatures. So there's Balrogs, there's drakes and dragons, although drake and dragon is interchangeable. But in this description, in this story, The Fall of Gondolin, as it was written by Tolkien way back when, Morgoth represents, or doesn't represent, because it shouldn't be allegorical, but it's difficult to not read it that Morgoth represents the coming of a new type of warfare. Obviously, Tolkien, many people know, Tolkien fought in World War One. And World War One was a turning point in the creation, I believe, of armoured divisions in war. Before that, people were always, cavalry divisions still existed, even in World War One, of course. But tanks began to be created, and armoured vehicles and armoured personnel carriers, things like that started to come forward. And it's difficult not to read that into the story of the Fall of Gondolin, because the orcs are said to attack Gondolin in great iron snakes, or iron drakes, as they're described as. And it's difficult to actually pinpoint exactly what these are, and I as I say, I haven't got an image of it, I'm afraid. But these very much seem to be armoured personnel carriers. They are made of iron, they move with smog and smoke and fire pushing them forwards, and troops issue forth from them. And it is even said, as we'll discover in a while, but as I say, I gloss over it in the main narrative when we come to that in a moment, but the walls of Gondolin are so strong and so powerful that mere siege equipment would not knock them down, and instead, Gothmog, who leads the attack on Gondolin, he orders these iron snakes to mount on top of each other, so much so that their weight is just too great for the wall, and it collapses under their weight. And indeed, that gets them to the high points of the walls as well. So, obviously, later on down the line, Tolkien removed all of this kind of imagery, anything related to an iron tank-like vehicle. But it should be noted that in the original writing of The Fall of Gondolin, there are essentially tanks that attack Gondolin. Now, they don't have any weaponry, they don't fire, there's no gunpowder, there's nothing like that. But they are iron armoured personnel carriers, and there's no way around that, I'm afraid. I mean, if Tolkien had gone back and revisited it, I think they would be changed to just be giant serpents or dragons or actual drakes. But in the description, they are clearly listed as being made of iron, and that's a very interesting point to note. But as I say, I don't actually reference them any further from here on out because they're never mentioned ever again. And as this story is not listed as purely canonical, I think it's fair to assume Tolkien removed them from his mind when he thought about how the Legendarium would actually take shape. And I don't think they would have made the final cut. So, the main story then, the fall. The army is seen over the mountains. Turgon calls a great council in the centre of the city, and all of the lords are in attendance that I've listed previously. Now, Tuor, being one of the finest defenders and closest allies to Turgon, he suggests that they actually sally out. He says, let's send our armies out, meet the enemy on the plain, and let the women and children escape. If we can catch the enemy before they surround the city, we might be able to get people out. However, Maeglin, and particularly Salgant, they counsel strongly against this, and they are in with the counsels of the king such that he sides with them. So the decision is made to hold the city. Now, as I say, Melkor's army then arrives at the city unhindered because nobody sallies out to meet them, but they cannot assail the walls. And this is where, as I say, Gothmog then orders these great iron snakes, that's how they're described, to pile against the wall such that it could not hold them. And the wall then collapses under the weight of these great colossal beasts, which is all we shall say. The wall then comes down. Now the elves, this is a great dismay to the elves because the strength of Gondolin lies in its walls as well as in its armies, but chiefly in its walls, and nothing to this point could have breached the walls of Gondolin. So the elves mentally are now totally on the back foot with the knowledge that their wall has fallen with almost on the first day of this great siege. So that there's a breach in the wall and Morgoth's army floods in. However, in an attempt to counter this, Rog and Galdor, the two arguably of the finest warriors of Gondolin, the leader of the House of the Hammer of Wrath and the House of the Tree, they lead a counterattack with their melee forces, trying to plug the breach. And Tolkien describes the arrows of the House of the Swallow and the Heavenly Arch firing from the walls. He says that they fly like dark rains of autumn, almost akin to the line of 300, the film, where he says their arrows will blot out the sun. It's described in that magnitude. Thousands upon thousands of arrows loosed from the walls rain into this vast army, with Rog and Galdor holding the gap in the wall to the best of their ability. However, the numbers are just too great. Morgoth, I don't have any exact numbers, but he vastly outnumbers the city of Gondolin with the army that he has. Oh, and whilst I keep saying Morgoth's army, do note, of course, he does not attack the city himself. He does not come forward and lead this army. Gothmog is the leader of the army. He's also the head of the Balrogs. He's the chief Balrog. But as I say, the numbers are too great then, and the elves are beaten back through the gap in the city walls. And the enemy claims the northern section of the city, because the forces of Angband and the forces of Morgoth have come from the northern side of the plain, and that's where they break through. Now, in the midst of all this carnage, Tuor breaks a little bit away from the wars because he wants to ensure the safety of his wife and his child. Obviously, they know that they've dug this secret tunnel, and he wants to ensure that Idril and Eärendel escape. So he returns to his home, and on his way back, he finds Maeglin's guard around his house. And this obviously dismays him greatly, for Maeglin has thought very much the same as Tuor, but with a far more darker intent. And Maeglin has pressed on for Idril. Maeglin knows now, and something that I didn't mention before, Morgoth never intended to keep his bargain with Maeglin. He wants to raze this city to the ground and kill everyone inside, Maeglin included. And Maeglin kind of learns that. As soon as he sees the army that Morgoth has sent, he realises there's no way him and Idril are going to be allowed to rule this city because it will be destroyed, and there's no way he'll even be allowed to live. So he rushes for Idril in an attempt to take her for his own and hope that Tuor dies in the fighting. But Tuor arrives at the same time, and he sees Idril and Eärendel being dragged up to the battlements by Maeglin. Maeglin's plan is to throw Eärendel from the walls into the fires below and claim Idril for his own. However, Tuor is basically the best warrior that Gondolin has. Him and Ecthelion Galdor, Glorfindel, and and that's it really. Those four, and Rog, sorry, they are absolutely mind-bendingly good fighters. And that's something to take note throughout. But Tuor gives an almighty roar, and it's apparently so great that the orcs in earshot actually stop and quake in terror of the sound that issues forth from Tuor. And he and his guard, the House of the Wing, they slay all of Maeglin's guard who are about the house, men of the House of the Mole. Now, Maeglin tries to stab Eärendel as he sees Tuor coming. Obviously, he hears the roar. He wants to ensure Eärendel's killed. He tries to stab him. But Eärendel is quite a savvy little child and realises that he's about to be stabbed, and he bites Maeglin. And this pain, the pain of the bite, distracts Maeglin such that the blow is very, very weakened, and the armour of Eärendel deflects the blow, so it doesn't take any damage. And then this little fracas allows Tuor to arrive, and he jumps on Maeglin. Now, Tuor's strength and anger was such that as he grabs Maeglin by the arm, he actually breaks his arm, just pulling him off of Eärendel. His anger is so great. And he just throws him from the wall. The battle is over in seconds. Tuor arrives, grabs Maeglin by the arm, breaks his arm, and then throws him over the wall. And it is said that as Maeglin fell from the walls, he hit upon the hill of Amun-Goreth 3 times before finally falling to his death in the pits below. Now, side note from the story here, this is exactly as was prophesied by Maeglin's father, Eol. As Eol is being thrown from the walls in the previous episode of these lore series, he cries out to Maeglin and he says, "This same fate will befall you, mark my words," and it does. Tuor throws Maeglin from the walls and Maeglin's time in the story ends. So he loses everything for his treachery and it is entirely on him that Gondolin falls. Because, spoiler alert, as I'm sure you're aware, Gondolin falls. This is a tragedy from start to finish, I'm afraid. Now, the rest of the mole, very kind of split loyalties now. They don't want to join with the orcs, but equally their great leader has just died. They're the ones that venture outside the city. They have loyalty to Maeglin. So they attack Tuor and his guards, the House of the Wing. But they are absolutely no match for the finest house, and Tuor and his guards dispatch them easily. So then Tuor leaves his oldest and dearest friend Voronwë, who escorted him all the way from the shores of Beleriand right through to Gondolin. He leaves Voronwë to guard Idril, and Tuor heads off to fight at the gate. Now, the battle at the gate was absolutely fierce. Obviously, they did bring siege equipment with them, and whilst they'd broken through the wall, they needed to break through in other locations as well. And the gate on the, I believe, western side is one of those locations. The guardian of the gate at the start of the battle was Dwelin, the leader of the House of the Swallow, one of the archery houses, and he is killed by a fiery bolt from one of the Balrogs. Now, it's unclear if this is an actual, like, a fire shaped into a bolt, or if it's just a flaming bolt, or if it's a dart that just kind of appears as flame. Who knows? But he's killed by a fiery bolt from one of the Balrogs. The Balrogs are described as having these great darts of fire and flaming arrows, and as they launch them over the walls, the area around the gate is set aflame, and Gondolin's destruction grows from stage to stage, as now a fire takes root within the city itself. Now, before this battle, no Balrog had ever been slain by elf, nor man, nor dwarf, nor beast. They are absolutely feared. But seeing the fire set all about the city and the destruction that is inevitable of his home, Rog leads the Hammer, the House of the Hammer of Wrath. He sallies out of the city. He goes through the gate and they absolutely slaughter. This was an incredibly interesting passage to read. As Rog presses out through the gate, they just kill everything in their path. It's amazing how many they kill. Now, Rog and his House of the Hammer of Wrath meet the Balrogs at the gate, and this marks the first time Balrogs are slain, for Rog and the Hammer slay many. The Balrogs haven't known death yet, and this is quite, one would assume, quite a mental shake for them. Gothmog sees that this sally has some real weight to it, and he orders that the army of Rog be flanked. However, Rog, in his blind anger and hatred, pushes way out of the walls, out onto the plain of Tumladen itself. And he is utterly surrounded. The entirety of the House of the Hammer of Wrath is with him, and they one by one begin to die out on the plain. And in the end, the entire house perishes. Rog and every member of his house dies on the plain of Tumladen. But it is said that the ferocity of his house was such that for every life claimed from the house, 7 orcs paid for that death. So they commit a absolutely outstanding kill tally on the orcs, but they pay for it entirely. So the Gondolin then are slowly being beaten back. One of their finest warriors has now died. The House of the Swallow has lost their leader. All of the House of the Hammer of Wrath are dead. Some of their finest warriors are now gone. The orcs have breached the northern side of the city through the wall, and they've now set fire around the gate, and they're streaming in through the gate in the absence of Rog. So the entirety of the armies of Gondolin pull back to the centre of the city. And this is called the Square of the King. However, in the retreat, Penlod, the leader of the House of the Tower of Snow and the House of the Pillar, he falls as well. But they manage to blockade the centre of the city and they take counsel here. But it is at this stage, as they're defending then almost their second to last stand, that the sound of flutes plays upon the wind, and Ecthelion and the House of the Fountain, who were previously held in reserve, arrive to fight in the war as well. They come upon the orcs from a side entirely unlooked for, and such is their ferocity and the onset of their surprise that the orcs take heavy losses and begin to push back as well. And this is a very interesting point. Ecthelion, who I've currently got an image of on your screen at the moment, it is said that, again, this is an early draft, it may have been revisited, but this is such a cool thing. Ecthelion is said to have killed more orcs in this battle alone than have ever been killed in all the battles of elves and orcs put together. He kills more orcs now on his own than every single elf in existence up to that point had ever killed orcs. That is just outrageous. He is a formidable fighter, and it is such. His ferocity, his strength, and his kill tally are such that his name ever after becomes a war cry to the elves, right up to the days of their abandoning Middle-earth. Ecthelion remains as a war cry to them. He is perhaps the finest warrior the elves have ever known. Now, at this point as well, Tuor and the House of the Wing, they arrive as well, and they support Ecthelion, and they manage to push the orcs all the way back to the Burning Gate. The centre of the city is then gets a reprieve, if you will. And speaking of the centre of the city, here is a very nice image drawn up of the city in its totality. So in the middle there you can see the Square of the King with the Tower of Turgon just off to the side. On the eastern side of the city is the Great Market, which comes into the story in a moment. The Northern Gate and the Main Gate, where the enemies have broken through. Now, it may well be that the Northern Gate is where the enemy is set afire in the city, and at the point of Caragdur is possibly where they broke through the wall. But either way, they have broken, obviously, fully into the city. And you'll note there that Tuor's house is way down on the southwestern side. It is at the point, though, that Ecthelion and Tuor have pushed the orcs back to the gate that the Drakes finally join the fight. Drakes and Balrogs then push back the force of the elves. The orcs sally with the renewed attack of these Drakes, and Ecthelion and Tuor have to begin a retreat. In this fighting with the Drakes and the Balrogs, Ecthelion slays 3 Balrogs on his own, but Tuor and his mighty axe Dramborleg, they kill 5 Balrogs. So 8 Balrogs have already died just at the hands of Ecthelion and Tuor, so you can see how they were amended later in the story. In this fighting, though, Ecthelion becomes wounded and he loses his shield, so Tuor has to carry him all the way back to the centre of the city, and once again the elves are pushed back to the Square of the King. Galdor and the remaining houses of the Tree, Fountain, Swallow and Arch also now fall back completely. So these were the archers that were on the walls. In the centre of the square, there is a great fountain. You can see it just under the words there, the circle in the middle. And all of the last defenders of Gondolin gather around here for council. And it's at this point that Glorfindel also then enters the fighting, as he had been ambushed in the Great Market and had to pull his forces back as well. So the House of the Golden Flower was stationed on the eastern side to ensure that the Great Market would be protected and the enemy wouldn't flank to the square from that way. It then became apparent that Turgon had actually ordered the House of the Harp and Salgant, who I spoke of earlier. They had been sent to aid Glorfindel, but Salgant had forsaken his courage and he ordered his men to defend him, and he fled away from the enemy. However, unlike the House of the Mole, the House of the Harp abandoned Salgant. They disobeyed his order, and although late, they came to the aid of Glorfindel in the Great Market. Now, it is said that Salgant actually flees to his home, where he then cowers on his bed and presumably is killed by the fires of Gondolin, or perhaps the orcs find him and kill him that way. But either way, he comes out of the story now because he literally runs home and hides under his bed. So Glorfindel leads the remaining of the Harp and the House of the Golden Flower into the square as well. At this point, Eärendel also joins in, and forgive me, I can't remember which house he was the head of. But Eärendel comes into the story now as well, and his part in the tale is that he had been running essentially around the city with his house. And I desperately trying to remember what it is, and I cannot for the life of me, and I'm terribly sorry. But he is... Oh, no, Eärendel leads the Heavenly Arch, doesn't he? Anyway, it doesn't matter. He had been running around the city gathering all those that he could, civilians, women and children, and he manages to save quite a few. And they also now all arrive in the Square of the King. The women and children are sent into the Tower of Turgon for safety, and so all of the military might of Gondolin is now centred in the Square of the King. With blockades on all sides, they are beset on all sides. The orcs totally now surround inside the city, and the fires that were set by the Drake spread ever out. Every survivor then is in the centre, of course, bar the House of the Hammer of Wrath, for as I've said, they entirely perished. Now the enemy comes in full force, and Gothmog, leading 7 dragons, arrives at the square. Tuor and Eärendel then lead the counterattack and the main defence of the centre, and they jump from each gate to gate, holding back the orcs, commanding the elves, leading the defence. However, eventually a drake breaks through the northern gate to the centre, and Tuor and Eärendel become separated. And the enemy pushes into the square on the back of this drake. Gothmog also enters the city behind the drake, and he bears down on Tuor. And he forces him back so that he is back up against the fountain in the centre of the city. Gothmog ready to strike the crippling and killing blow finally on Tuor and essentially end this. With Tuor dead, the armies of Gondolin would be so disheartened. He manages to beat Tuor to the ground, and he completely gets the better of him. Tuor cannot hope to resist Gothmog. But then Ecthelion, wounded on the floor, watching all of this unfolds, leaps to Tuor's aid. And he swings down hard on Gothmog's sword arm, and it's such that Gothmog loses grip of his sword. And then with every ounce of Ecthelion's being, he charges at Gothmog. And it's said that Ecthelion, as you can see sort of in the image there, he has a helmet with a spike on it. And he quite literally headbutts Gothmog's chest so that he drives this spike on his helmet deep into Gothmog's chest, and he pushes him into the fountain in the centre of the city. Gothmog falls into the fountain and perishes, but unfortunately Ecthelion goes with him. The finest warrior in all of the history of the Noldor falls, but takes the leader of the Balrogs with him. But the fountain then becomes a place of great sorrow. And the situation is made all the worse in a few moments. But before then, the king finally then enters into the battle. Seeing his greatest generals dying around him and his army beset in the very centre of the city, Turgon issues forth out of the tower that bears his name with his house, the House of the King, the finest, of course, warriors of Gondolin. This makes the the elves fight with renewed strength now that their king is finally here. But in the maelstrom and in the melee, a dragon is killed and falls into the fountain. Now, such is the strange magic of the dragons that when the water quenches the soul of the dragon, or whatever it does, a great mist goes up and covers the entire courtyard so that none can see. The fountain itself runs dry and is ever after scarred and masked. At this point, Turgon very much loses hope. But Tuor does not. He still knows that there's a way out of the city. He prays that his house has not been discovered because it's on the far southern side. But Turgon has very much lost hope. And they take counsel, and Tuor bids that they make for the tunnel. He informs all the survivors of this exit, and he prays and begs Turgon to come with him. Let's flee the city. Turgon, however, orders them to go, and like a captain with his ship, decrees that he will stay. His guard gather around him in utter defiance of the nonsense that they're facing, and Turgon makes a final stand in the city. Tuor then leads every survivor that he can down to his home, where fortunately it is free and clear, and they make it down to find Idril and Voronwë still waiting for them, despite Tuor having ordered them to depart. They managed to escape purely because the orcs become so intent on A, killing Turgon, and B, ensuring the destruction of his tower, for they are the two symbols of Gondolin, and with both of those down, the orcs will truly have won the day. And this allows Tuor and all of the remaining forces to escape. Glorfindel and the House of the Golden Flower hold up the rear guard, and they make sure that everyone gets out, save, of course, for Turgon and the House of the King. Now, it is not actually clear how Turgon dies, but as the survivors escape the city, they see the tower destroyed. And it's unclear whether Turgon dies in the destruction of the tower, so it quite literally crushes him, or whether he's actually killed first and then the tower falls. But either way, Turgon and the city of Gondolin are destroyed. The forces of the orcs are just far too great, and the defenders never stood a chance. Now, a number of the elves actually don't agree with going through Tuor's tunnel, and they opt to go on the conventional way of escape. So Gondolin does have a pre-planned escape method that leads out into the mountains without having to go through the gates of the city. Or, sorry, no. The enemy, so there isn't actually an escape from the city, apologies. So that all of the elves escape through Tuor's secret tunnel, which comes out in the plain of Tumladen. So as you can see in the image there, it actually comes out of the city just a little way outside the city. It is said that the plain of Tumladen is very hard to mine through, and because Idril wanted total secrecy, they couldn't send masses and masses of elves down there, so the tunnel never made it that far. So they come out in the plain. Now, in the actual story, they escape south, away from the direction that Morgoth's army came, and they escape out the mountains that way. But this is later amended to, in the Silmarillion, you read that the tunnel actually comes out on the northern side. So, basically to confuse Morgoth, they flee towards him rather than away from him, because he would have thought they'd flee south, west, or east. So he posts guards there, and he leaves virtually nothing on the northern side, and the elves go out that way. So they actually go back towards Morgoth to escape from him and into the Eagle's Cleft. But as they come out onto the plain, a group of the elves don't want to go the way that Tuor suggests. Why would you run north towards Morgoth? So they try and flee the conventional way of escape, which is a secondary path through the mountains that the elves would have used to flee Gondolin. However, Maeglin's treachery comes full circle, for he informed Morgoth of this way of escape, and Morgoth posted guards there, and every elf that opted to take that standard path was also slain. Now, the elves that didn't take that path are led by one Legolas Greenleaf, and I know what you're thinking, and the answer is no. This is 100% not Legolas from the Fellowship of the Ring. Entirely different elf, totally coincidental that he has exactly the same name, including the surname. Although it should be noted that Legolas means Greenleaf in, I can't recall if it's Sindarin. I think it is Sindarin. Anyway, I've got a little note here in my notes. Legolas Greenleaf, not that one. Anyway, the survivors are led by Legolas. Now, this Legolas is said to have absolutely piercing vision, and he can see very far, and he knows the paths of the mountains well, and he proves to be an excellent guide. However, Tuor, throughout all of this, I should have mentioned, Idril and Voronwë had actually agreed to send Eärendel through the tunnel first to get him out. Idril couldn't bear to leave the city knowing that her father and husband were still fighting, but she sent Eärendel and a small group of guards away. Tuor is very concerned because as they enter out into the plain, there's no sight of Eärendel, and he has no idea what's become of him. And as they start to make their way across the plain, though, Tuor finally, when they reach the mountains, looks down on the plain and sees Eärendel's group. And they are being chased by a group of orcs riding wolves. So Tuor takes the 50 freshest elves, if you will, those least tired, and he pursues these orcs to bear down upon his son. And he is successful, fortunately, as I'm sure you're all aware, because Eärendel is the father of Elrond. But, all of the orcs are slain, and not one of them manages to run back to the city to tell of these escaping forces. And Eärendel and Tuor return to the group. Now, it's also noted here that Eärendel is actually very sad to hear that Salgant has died, because it's said that during the peacetime of Gondolin, and in Eärendel's 7 years prior, Salgant actually acts as one of his closest friends. They get on incredibly well, and Salgant often tells him stories that he likes to listen to. And it's said that he's very, very upset to hear that Salgant had perished. So then the final point in the tale, and the finest of tragedies, as the party crosses into the Eagle's Cleft, the Crysthorn, which is a part of the mountain where the eagles live. Legolas is leading from the front and Glorfindel is defending from the rear. And as they push through the mountains, there is a small guard of Morgoth's forces posted there. The company are ambushed by orcs, and this party is led by a Balrog. Galdor and Glorfindel lead the front and back defences as this column of survivors is ambushed on all sides. Galdor leading from the front and Glorfindel holding the rear. The orcs are slowly getting the drop on this beleaguered and exhausted party of escapees until finally Thorondor, the king of eagles, arose and comes to the aid of the Noldor. Thorondor is the predecessor of Gwaihir, the king of eagles in the Third Age. But Thorondor and his eagles set upon the orcs and it manages to save the Noldor. However, the Balrog that led this force is set to be twice the size of an elf, and it leaps in amongst the women, children, and the injured. Glorfindel, however, rushes to the aid of those that are being slaughtered by the Balrog, and he manages to fight it out of the column and fight it away from the survivors, and the battle ensues. Glorfindel manages to cut the Balrog's arm, weakening its grip, and he stabs at its shoulder, but as he does so, the Balrog grapples him. However, Glorfindel, being a fine warrior, switches to a knife and cuts open the belly of the Balrog. But in the ensuing melee, the two fall from the edge of the mountainside. And Glorfindel is last seen diving after this Balrog, and like Icthelion, both perish again. So Glorfindel saves the survivors of the column, but it costs him his life. And that is a very cool depiction of Glorfindel diving after the Balrog, I think, personally. However, Glorfindel's story does not end there, of course, but also doesn't end there in the short term, because Thorondor, seeing the great feat this elf has just done and the sacrifice he's made, he flies down to the bottom of the abyss that the two fell into from the mountainside, and he brings Glorfindel's body back up to the mountains. It's then said that Glorfindel is buried under a great cairn of yellow flowers. And ever after, despite it being high up in the mountainside, this place would forever bloom with these great golden flowers. So the party finally make it out. Tuor, Idril, Voronwë, Galdor and Igalmoth being the last remaining survivors of the houses and the lords of Gondolin, and they make their way south. They come down the river Sirion, which is the Beleriand's answer to the Anduin, very much. It's the longest and greatest river in Beleriand. And they flee down all the way to its mouth on the coast with the Great Sea, Belegar. And here they create a dwelling known as Nan Tathran, where they live by the shores of the sea. However, in time, Tuor and Eärendel begin to become seafarers, and eventually they build a great ship for the call of Ulmo, which is the call that all elves feel, the desire to sail west, to sail away from the troubles of Middle-earth. This grows in both of them. And Tuor and Eärendel sail west and are never heard of again. Now, this is not specified that they're never heard of again in Middle-earth, or they're never heard of again ever. But it's very much assumed that they actually make it to Aman, to Valinor, and they live out the rest of their days there. And this is where the story takes a bit of a strange turn, because this is the only incident where this is recorded, and it's said that Tuor, who is a man, a human being, he became numbered among the Eldar race and was joined with the Noldor, whom he loved so dearly. And apparently his fate was sundered from the race of men, which only suggests, and I would welcome your thoughts and comments on it, but it seems very much that Tolkien intended that Tuor is basically, I'm not sure of the word, promoted to be one of the Noldor, and he then lives his days in Valinor. But that would make him one of the first humans to set foot in Valinor, if not the first. He'd be the first human to set foot in Valinor, but he's not technically a human, so it doesn't count. I'm not really too sure. But that is where the story ends. Tuor and Eärendel flee Middle-earth, and they leave their son behind. But of course, over the years, he becomes fully grown, and it doesn't matter as much. And thus, Gondolin falls from the histories of Middle-earth. And with the sack and destruction of Gondolin, it is now only a few years, really, until the fall of Beleriand in its entirety. Because, of course, whether I've covered this before or not, or whether I'll cover this in future, Eärendel, the son of Tuor and Eärendel, is better known as being Eärendel the Mariner. And he is known as the Mariner because he sails for Valinor successfully, and he beseeches the Valar to return to Middle-earth, return to Beleriand, and destroy Morgoth, which they, of course, do. Eärendil becomes something of a great mythical hero to the peoples of Beleriand, for he saves them. And he then eventually flies the skies forever in his boat Vingelot, guiding a Silmaril around the skies, which is how his fate ends. Which is, again, another one of those where a very grounded and realistic story suddenly takes on a very mythical ending. For Eärendil sails into the sky on his boat with his wife, Elwing, where they kill a dragon. This is all spoiler alert, I'm afraid. They kill a dragon, and then with a Silmaril at the brow of their ship, they then sail the skies forever till the end of time, despite the fact that Eärendil is, of course, half elf, half human. But then let's assume he chose to be an elf. But anyway, that concludes the story of the fall of Gondolin, but not the end of the episode, as there's a few bits and bobs of note from the fall of Gondolin story, which I'd like to just mention. I've already spoken that Legolas Greenleaf is not the same Legolas. Of course, that the Balrogs, throughout this, as I said about the Balrogs at the beginning, at least, say, 15 Balrogs are killed in this battle alone. Whereas Tolkien then eventually settles on the idea that there are only 7 Balrogs that have ever existed, Gothmog included. So it would become more, I believe, to apply our own attempts at turning the story to be more canonical, I would suggest that the Balrog that Glorfindel kills is one of the 7 Balrogs. I'd suggest, obviously, that Ithilien still kills Gothmog, and perhaps it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say that Rog does kill a Balrog at the gate. So Rog would have the honour of being the first free person, which was what we should call all elves, dwarves, men, whatever. He is the first to have ever slain a Balrog. Then Ithilien kills Gothmog, and then Glorfindel kills one in the defence. And it would then be suggested that the 8 Balrogs that are killed by Tuor and Ithilien, maybe they're just lowered to lesser forms of orcs, superior form of orcs rather than Balrogs. Because, of course, one Balrog has to escape the downfall of Beleriand. And if we say that 3 of them have already been killed, the Balrog Durin's Bane would be the 4th. So the other 3 Balrogs, one would assume, are destroyed in the War of Wrath at the end of Beleriand. That's all we can surmise. But another interesting feature is that in this story, Gothmog is actually called the son of Melko. And it should be noted that in the earlier versions of the Legendarium, Melkor is actually known as Melko. Same spelling, but without an R. And Gothmog is listed as being his actual son rather than his just chief lieutenant. But again, I think that is edited and changed, for it's known that the Balrogs in the later Legendarium are actually fallen Maiar, same as Gandalf, same as Radagast, the Blue Wizards, all of those. And and as Melkor is never known to have taken any form of bride, it'd be difficult for him to have had a child. But in the earlier stories, Gothmog is listed as his son. Additionally, some of the other names have changed. The Noldor, who are the chief elves throughout the story, originally they were called the Noldoli, D-O-L-I, rather than Noldor. And so they're called the Noldoli, or Noldoli, depending on how you want to say it. But if you go even further back, in the very beginning of the creation of Middle-earth, the elves were actually called gnomes. And throughout the story of the fall of Gondolin, as it's written in the complete history, they're often referred to as gnomes. It's said that Maeglin is the chief gnome who... or the chief of the gnomes who mine outside the city. There's a few points where gnome is used. And obviously in our modern day minds, a gnome is a small little decorative ornament that sits in people's gardens and looks absolutely awful, and only old people have them. And so it's very peculiar to think of these great heroes being called gnomes, but originally they were. But eventually Tolkien settled on elves in general, and of course Noldoli became Noldor. I should also state, something I didn't talk about but is present in the story, is in the writing, The Fall of Gondolin, the Valar are actually called gods. So later on in the story, he changes it and they become the Valar, they become the Ainur, they are creatures of myth, and they are a kind of gods, but they're never directly called gods. However, in this story, when it was first written, they are called gods. And indeed, there is a temple in Gondolin. Sorry, this image isn't at a temple, I just went back to the map for you. But there is a temple in Gondolin called the Temple of the Gods, not the Temple of the Valar, which I think is very, very interesting. The Gondolin also changed their name in later versions, and as well now, shall we say, they're called the Gondolin Rim, whereas in the story they're actually called the Gondothlim. And that describes all the peoples of Gondolin. But the final point, and the one I find the most interesting, because it really is a clear parallel of Tolkien linking Middle-earth to our world, is that in this story, toward the end, he directly references the city of Babylon. And he says that Babylon is a place in Middle-earth. Now, of course, this is one of the features that then falls out of the story and is no longer canonical. But it's just fascinating to note that that was his mental path, that this was going to form into our history that much, that a very famous city from semi-folklore, semi-mythological, but entirely also it was real, the city of Babylon. There's dispute as whether or not the Hanging of Gardens of Babylon, for example, there's dispute whether or not they ever actually existed at all. But anyway, that's by the by. So it's interesting that Tolkien links Babylon into the story, and he does indeed. So this is a really interesting read. If you want to read the complete histories of Middle-earth, but you don't just want to read from start to finish, then do read The Fall of Gondolin, because it really is an eye-opener in terms of what Tolkien was thinking at the beginning and then how his mentality changed as it went on, particularly with those three major features. Four really. The one that the gnomes become the elves and that the gods become the Valar. And of course that the Balrogs go from being super soldiers or slightly more numerous superior orcs to being very rare but incredibly powerful beings. And of course the iron snakes that besiege Gondolin that fall out of the story as well. So that concludes the story of Gondolin. A tragic tale from start to finish, really. Numerous times Turgon was warned to flee the city. And of course, the overall prophecy of Ulmo comes true, where he warns Turgon that whilst Gondolin may stand for a while, and a strong city it may be, it will never stand forever, and he should flee. But he never does, and he dies with his city. Which means, because he is the High King at the time of his death, and the High King ship then passes, I think it's at this stage, to Gil-galad's father. Oh, I can't remember. It's either it passes to Gil-galad or it passes to Gil-galad's father, which is one of the elves. I don't know. Anyway, when Turgon dies, the High Kingship passes because he was the High King. Interestingly, for you all as well, on this map, the Nan Tathrin, where the elves escaped to, is not actually fully shown. You can just see a tiny little bit of it in the south there of the map, where it lists the forest of Nan Tathrin. And just below that is the mouths of the Syrian, where they come to reside, as far away from Melkor as they can get. But I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. Do please leave feedback as ever. A question that I've seen posted quite a lot is, why are there no longer comments on the older videos? And that is because in the older videos, I do ask some questions that have been answered now a million times, and I just got bored of reading the answer over and over and over again. I also get people telling me that I should stop making this noise, which I like to think that I have stopped making that noise. Hopefully I've worked that out of my delivery. But of course, the original videos were filmed now over a year ago, ages ago. And it's just got so boring being told the same thing over and over. The comments on the videos, for every one comment that was like, oh, this was a really interesting video, there were 4 comments answering a question or telling me something I've been told a million times. And I just didn't want to see those in my feed anymore, basically. So I disabled the comments. So that's why you can't comment on the older lore videos. The next lore video, I have no idea what it will be. I'll have to have a proper think. And again, it will likely be this far away from the last ones. Stop asking me when the lore videos are going to be. You can see the pattern that they are just once every few months, once every month. They're few and far between. Stop asking me. I can't change you asking me, of course, but it's bloody annoying. But anyway, do please leave feedback. But also do please check the date of this video, and if about a year has passed, perhaps I'm no longer interested in feedback. So, cheers for that one. But until we speak again, dear friends, Eärendel, and farewell.